You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Good morning and welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where we get great Australians who've done interesting things to teach us things that will help us grow our businesses and have better lives. And this morning, I could not be happier than to have Andrew Abercrombie, the chairman of Hum Group Limited, formerly FlexiRent, to join us. Good morning, Drew.
Good morning, Brett.
Now, you're down there in sunny Melbourne.
I am. It's only 5 degrees.
Yeah, we're up here in rainy Sydney.
Yeah.
Where it's going to rain again. I think we're going to get a month's worth in 3 days, they say. But I love to always start at the beginning. Can you share with us where you grew up and what your training was and how you came to start what became Flexi Group?
Yeah, well, how long have you got? I am 60 plus, you know that. But I'm a tale of two cities. I had a Sydney mum and a Melbourne dad, so I'm very fortunate in that regard because they're both homes for me and they're culturally quite distinctive. But I ended up born in Sydney, went to Melbourne when I was very young, probably 5. So I went to school and university in Melbourne. I think of that as home. I would probably live in Sydney had I not married a Melbourne girl. So be that as it may. Yes, I did. I was always entrepreneurial, I suppose. I had about 5 paper rounds when I was a kid and then put myself through university buying and selling motorcycles, then motor cars, then houses. Not by inheritance, simply just figured it out. You know, I found an arbitrage when I was about 19 that you could buy certain types of cars in Sydney and sell them for more in Melbourne. So that created the deposit for my first house, which makes young people envious when I tell them I bought for $16,000. You know, a triple-fronted weatherboard in Richmond, which for non-Melbourne dwellers is perhaps like Surrey Hills in Sydney. Renovated it, and by the time I graduated, I owned 1.5 houses. So it's almost impossible to do these days. So I know I was very fortunate, but I suppose it was the first lesson in life that, you know, luck is a coincidence of talent and opportunity. So you've got to be looking for the opportunities. But so I desperately wanted to do medicine, but I didn't get there academically, despite getting enough marks. I'd done a second year 12 and got penalised 10%. So life's tough. But it was a sliding doors moment in the sense that probably the best thing that ever happened to me. And so I then did economics, followed by law at Monash Uni, and then started practicing in 1980 and had a hugely fun decade, I suppose. I was less than that. I practiced for about 8 years. So I had my own firm with a couple of partners by the time I was 26. Then we opened a branch office in Sydney. So I moved back up to Sydney, lived there for 3 or 4 years. We specialised in taxation, which got us into film production, which got us into the entertainment industry. So those years in Sydney as a under 30-year-old heterosexual, and bearing in mind Sydney was gay headquarters of the world back then, it was a very great place to be, especially being connected into the entertainment industry. So I used to act for In Excess and Cold Chisel and Eurogliders and all sorts of bands that you virtually have to be over 50 to remember, but they were halcyon days. That as I was approaching 30, I'm thinking, crikey, that's really old. I don't think I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. So I'd been mulling this over for quite a few years, really, but approaching that age, which seemed awfully old, I thought it was time for a change. So I'd learnt that I loved wheeling and dealing, and I thought I want to do the big league. And negotiating well as a lawyer is fantastic for your client, but you can't really charge any upside on the deal. And in fact, in those days, you were limited by this grotesque piece of legislation called the Solicitor's Remuneration Order. And I remember making $500,000, which was a hell of a lot in those days for a client. And my maximum fee charge was $5,000. I want to act for myself. So I sort of thought deeply about that, went to New York, got a job, but at the same time decided I'd apply for an MBA. It was a long shot, a really long shot, but one of the best, probably the best decision I've ever made. And more by good luck than good management, I made it into what was then known as IMADE, which is a business school in Switzerland, generally regarded as Harvard's European sister school. The two schools swap a lot of faculty and case studies and a lot of curriculum. And so it was just the most amazing environment. There was 65 people from about 2,000 applications from all over the world. And let me see, it was class of 67, I think it started as, 31 different countries, about 40 different background professions. I was one of about 3 Australians. And it was just the most amazing year of my life. And in terms of what I learned, the intensity of study, the friendships, the travel, just amazing. And then when I graduated, I got a job with Credit Suisse First Boston, as they were then called, in New York, doing mergers and acquisitions. So it was the pinnacle of my aspiration. Following about just haven't told this story for so long. I can barely remember. I think I had about 15 interviews in London, and then another 17 in New York. Finally got this job. But unfortunately for me, or fortunate, depending which way you look at it, it was 1989, which the wheels fell off the economy quite severely in that year. So after I'd been to New York and sort of sorted out the onboarding, found an apartment and so on, my boss-to-be rang me and said, well, Drew, you've got an MBA, at Life Means, last in, first out. Well, we've just retrenched 1,200 people from New York and you're one of them. So it's the job you had when you don't have a job. And that was absolutely devastating. But again, it was a sliding doors moment, like not getting into medicine, because the years that followed led me pretty much to where I am today, I suppose, which has been an amazing and rich life that I'm very fortunate to have enjoyed. So
you landed in New York in 1989.
Yep.
You did your MBA in 1988.
Yep.
You started your law firm in about 1982. 82.
Mm.
And then you're in New York.
Mm-hmm.
You lost your job.
Yep.
There's a massive stock market crash.
Yep.
What do you do next?
Yeah, well, I was in a spot of bother, Brett, and I'd spent my savings.
Getting a lease.
The MBA was pretty exy. But so, look, I lurched around the place. Look, thankfully, I had no obligations. I had no children, no wife, no mortgage. I was okay. Could live on the smell of an oily rag. And I wandered around the world almost literally. And, when you're fresh out of business school, you're employable for a couple of years, but only no more than that. And I got a couple of job offers, but that everything seemed second rate. After this fantastic job I thought I had at Credit Suisse. So I kind of became, I was fortunate because the law firm that I'd started with a couple of partners had been reasonably successful. And we had by the time I got back from Switzerland, my partners had agreed to merge the firm into quite a substantial, well-known second-tier firm in Melbourne called Cornwall Stoddart. And the partners there, whom I knew, offered me a full partnership, despite the fact that I wasn't involved in the merger because I'd already retired from my firm. And they offered me a full partnership anytime. So to know I could fall back on that was really, it gave me the security to keep searching, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In my heart of heart, I thought a man should only ever have to resign from law once in his life, So I was reluctant to get back into that, which is probably a good thing because it drove me to look for other opportunities. And I was just working in a consulting capacity with my old partners up in Sydney. And I stumbled across a group of bankrupt companies. By now it's 1990. And again, those of your audience who are old enough to remember, Brett, was the most savage recession, almost depression that I've ever lived through, at least in Australia. And, with interest rates of 20%, real estate trading at 50% of the value it had been trading for a few years ago, it was an absolute train smash for Australia. And it's not well remembered because what was for us, I would call almost a depression, was really just a bit of a blip for the rest of the world. And the situation was completely reversed if you fast forward 15 years to the global financial crisis, which was a complete train smash and depression in the rest of the world, but in Australia we hardly felt it.
And a blip.
So the early 90s was kind of the reverse of that. It was absolute economic carnage. And I thought I should be able to use this to my advantage. So it's a really long story how, but I stumbled across a group of bankrupt companies that were about to be put into liquidation, actually. I was going to say administration, but they were going to be put to death immediately with the assets sold off at dirt cheap. And again, those of us that are old enough would remember an American guy, Bob Joss, came in to run Westpac that had lost 2/3 of its balance sheet equity in the space of a couple of years.
Yeah.
He set up
I bought Westpac shares in 1993.
And you're a smart man, Brett. You would have done well. Remember, Kerry Packer made 100 million or so at the time.
Well, that's why, because I thought if he was
Kerry, yeah. Good move.
Probably won't die.
Wish I had, but I didn't have any capital to spend. So anyway, so it's again a long story, but I took a punt. I didn't have much money, but I had quite a bit of expertise after 8 or 9 years as a commercial lawyer, specialising in commercial law, company tax. I had the right skill set. I stayed away from crime and family and all the stuff that didn't interest me. And I was fresh out of business school, and it was I learned so much that year. And so I thought, okay, I can see a bit of an opportunity here. So with my legal skills, I could see that the Westpac Bank had made a lot of quite esoteric errors in their early documentation facilitating the loans to these companies. And I could also see that one of the businesses within that group, which had caused the failure, actually had some merit, if only it would run properly. So I leveraged the fact that Westpac would. I was able to convince the Westpac folk that their probability of seeking redress under their documentation was limited, and that I would fight them, which was a bluff because I didn't have the resources to fight them. And at the same time, put together a business plan to turn around this little leasing company that had caused the losses in the first instance. So it was a classic case of something that came for me an instilled principle, which is that when you're trying to negotiate, come to the party with a problem, but more importantly, come to the party with a solution to the problem.
Yeah.
And that was what I did with Westpac. And amazingly, people say there's no luck in life, but luck does play a part. And the luck for me was chancing upon one of the few guys in the Westpac bad bank that had both good brains, a good character, and big balls. And he backed me. And I told him that if he didn't back me, Westpac would be lucky to get 50 cents in the dollar. If he did back me, I'd guarantee 75 cents. And I ended up getting $1. I ended up getting Westpac 100 cents in the dollar. And this individual, for taking that initiative and backing me, got fired. So that tells you a lot about Australian banks. For decades afterwards, I backed him and gave him consulting projects and looked after him, but it was the most extraordinary story. Anyway, so that got me going. And then there's a series of sort of rungs up the ladder, you might say, that we took that